My name is Steve Ilardi. I'm a professor of psychology, University of Kansas. I've been there 15 years, and I'm a clinical psychologist. So that means I've been licensed and trained to both diagnose and treat various forms of mental illness.
And in what way is your focus on depression, or can you say a little more about your specialty?
Sure. Yeah. Well, really for the past 20 years, clinical depression has been the main focus of my work, both clinically and in a research context. And it's a devastating illness. It's one that robs people of their ability to function. It takes away their restorative sleep, takes away their ability to concentrate and focus, their energy, and ultimately causes so much devastation in their day-to-day life that they lose their ability to love and work and play, and very often lose their will to live.
What do you say to people who are struggling with depression?
The first thing I say is depression is treatable. Depression is, for the vast majority of individuals, not a permanent condition. Depression is something that is tragically misunderstood, and many people who suffer from depression have been told by well-intentioned friends and loved ones, oh, look, everyone gets depressed. You just need to snap out of it. You just need to cheer up. We're going to rally around, take you out to do something enjoyable, and you're just going to snap out of it. And the problem, Adam, is that depression is a tragically misunderstood term because it has two different meanings. There's one meaning that we all hear in day-to-day life, which is, hey, I'm depressed because my team lost. I'm depressed because I just had this setback at work. And what people mean is simply they're sad. We all get depressed in that sense. We all get sad. But unfortunately, the word depression also has come to be used as a clinical shorthand for a devastating illness, major depressive disorder in the parlance or in the language of clinical research. And so when somebody goes to their doctor, when they go to their psychologist, when they go to their therapist, and they hear, you're depressed, they're often really confused, and they think, well, wait a minute, doesn't everybody get depressed? And then they might have it explained to them, no, you have this illness, which we're going to call depression. They come home and they talk to their loved ones. They talk to their friends, and they say, I'm depressed, and their friends have no idea that they're talking about this devastating illness. Their friends think, oh, well, you're just temporarily sad.
Tell me about the root causes of, or some of the causes of the major depressive disorder, and then we'll talk about, what are some symptoms of that?
Sure. Well, many people, I would say probably fortunately, have over the past 10 to 20 years come to regard depressive illness for what it is, which is an illness, and they understand that there are neurological, physiological, biochemical underpinnings for the disorder. In fact, many people hear the term chemical imbalance. And for those of us who are actually clinical researchers, we think of that as an overly simplistic term. But it captures an essential reality, which is that depression involves profound disruption in the brain's ability to function, in our hormonal function, in the architecture, the underlying structure of our sleep. And essentially what we mean is the disappearance or erosion of the most restorative, deepest part of sleep. But what ultimately causes depression? Well, from a neurological perspective, we would say that the final common pathway underlying depression is the brain's stress response, which doesn't shut down. So we can think of it, here's a pithy way of saying it, the brain's runaway stress response, and then the body's reaction to that. And what essentially happens is when the stress response, which of course we're all wired to have, it's our fight or flight response. It's adaptive, it's healthy, we're designed to have it. It's supposed to go off for a few minutes when we're facing physical danger, for a few minutes, maybe up to an hour when we're facing some sort of situation that calls for vigorous activation. The problem for many of us, and indeed I would say for most Americans, is that modern life is so poorly calibrated to the needs of our bodies, our minds, our spirits, that we wind up with a runaway stress response. And what this can ultimately lead to for many individuals, up to 1 in 4 Americans now, is this devastating illness of depression, where the brain interprets that runaway response as physical illness. In fact, it reacts to the runaway stress response in exactly the same way that it reacts to an infectious illness like influenza, where you get a high fever, and what happens? The brain says, oh, okay, there's this illness, it's time to do two things. Number one, shut down to get lots of restorative rest, and number two, pull away and withdraw socially. So when we have the flu, we don't feel like being around anyone, and all we want to do is just crawl into a hole somewhere and recover and heal. When the person's clinically depressed, they have that same impulse, but now here's the tragedy. They are pulling away from the very people who could actually help them out of that hole of depression. So when we have the flu, that impulse to withdraw, healthy and adaptive. When we're facing that runaway stress response, the ensuing depression and impulse to withdraw is tragic because it just perpetuates the cycle.
Tell me about the symptoms of depression, of this depressive disorder.
Sure. Well, they're diagnostically, in our diagnostic manual, as it were, there are 9 core symptoms. And just very quickly, they are the sad mood, which is hallmark. It's not universal, but that feeling of intense sadness, and very often for many individuals with depression, intense suffering, because the brain's pain circuits also light up. And the circuits of the brain that register physical pain are right next door to the circuits that register emotional pain, and they're interwoven with one another. So when we experience physical pain, there's also an emotional component. Likewise, when we have emotional pain of clinical depression, there's physical pain. And many depressed individuals will talk about this sense of, I hurt and I can't really describe where, but it's a type of torment. It's a type of unrelenting torment. When that's combined with another symptom of depression, which is a sort of negative interpretive bias. And what I mean by that is simply when people are depressed, it's as if they start viewing the world through very dark lenses, where they start viewing the world through this jaundiced, jaded perspective of everything is dark and bleak and hopeless, and I'm horrible, and it's never going to get better. And when people are suffering and they're hopeless, that leads to another symptom of depression, which is thoughts about death or suicidality. Because for many individuals who are in that state, death starts to seem like a very welcome escape. They feel like it's never going to get better. They can't see any other way out. Other symptoms include social withdrawal, which we've talked about a little bit. They include disruptions to sleep. They include disruptions to appetite, intense fatigue, a slowing down, we call it psychomotor retardation, or a slowing of motor movement. So when they get severely depressed, you'll often see their speech gets very slow, their movements get slow. And then finally, cognitive problems, deficits in memory and attention. Many people with depression will tell you they can no longer read. They can't even read a paragraph, say, from a newspaper article. They can't focus on anything. They have trouble focusing on conversation. So depression is an illness really that affects all areas of one's life and one's ability to function.
Is there any hope for people with depression?
There's enormous hope. Depression, I had an insight, I think. I had an epiphany about 7 years ago as somebody who'd been studying depression for my whole career. And the insight was really based on the work of an anthropologist, somebody from a completely different field, is a guy named Edward Schieffelin, who had spent about 10 years of his life with a modern-day hunter-gatherer or aboriginal people in Papua New Guinea. They're called the Kaluli. And Schieffelin was interested in whether or not the Kaluli suffered from the same sorts of illnesses that we do. And medical anthropologists for a long time have noticed that a lot of the diseases that afflict us Westerners are largely absent from Aboriginal groups. Diseases like atherosclerosis or hardening of the arteries, obesity, diabetes, allergies, asthma, fibromyalgia, lupus. I mean, it's a very long list, and they're thought of as diseases of civilization. And Schieffelin found that with the Kaluli, they don't get clinically depressed, which is remarkable because they have really hard lives. Right? They don't live as long as we do because they fight parasitic infection. They have a high rate of infant mortality. They have a high rate of death due to violence, and yet they don't get clinically depressed. They grieve when they lose someone that they care about. That's a natural human reaction, but they don't get shut down. for months and years on end the way we do. They don't have this epidemic at all. And so I started thinking about the fact that here in America, we have this epidemic of depression, like we have an epidemic of heart disease and obesity, and these are everyone that are well known. Is it possible that the very same sorts of considerations are in play? In other words, we've been treating depression for the past 20 years as this mysterious chemical imbalance that we need to throw a lot of chemicals at, because the rate of antidepressant use in this country has tripled in the past 20 years, and it hasn't made a dent. In fact, the epidemic keeps getting worse and worse and worse. So the drugs haven't been completely game-changing. They have helped many people, but they help a lot fewer people than I think is widely believed or appreciated. Now that sounds like not a very hopeful message, right? When people hear me say, well, you know, the medications can be useful, but they're really not all they're cracked up to be. They don't lead to long-term cure for most individuals who take them. And yet there's profound hope, because what's been discovered and what I've seen in my research for the past 6 years is what we do profoundly changes how our brain functions, how our mind functions. It profoundly changes all of the neurological underpinnings of clinical depression. And so what I began to do 6 years ago is to identify what are hunter-gatherers doing that we're not, that's protecting them, that's putting the brakes on the brain's stress response. What are traditional agrarian groups doing? Because we know they have a much lower rate of depression. The Amish, for example, have a much lower rate of depression than the rest of their American counterparts. So what are they doing that's protecting them? What did our great-grandparents do? Because in fact, their rate of depression, we know from pretty reasonably good medical records, was dramatically lower than ours. And yet, I think arguably, their lives were no easier than ours. But there's something they were doing that was protecting them. Or maybe I can turn it on its head and put it this way. 21st century American life is physically and psychologically toxic in several key ways. So can we identify the ways in which we were never designed for modern life? And what I believe I've discovered is we were never designed for a sedentary, fast food laden, socially isolated, indoor, sleep deprived, frenzied pace of modern American life. And it's that lifestyle that's driving the epidemic. That's the bad news. The good news is we can reclaim the healing habits of the past, weave them into the fabric of 21st century American life, and make a huge difference in the depression epidemic. And in fact, in our work at the University of Kansas over the past 6 years, we've seen patient after patient after patient not only find full healing from depression, but these are patients typically that have tried medications and haven't found them to be the answer. They've tried traditional forms of insight-oriented psychotherapy, and while they may have gained insight, didn't provide the answer for them, this has provided a path to healing for them. And so we're very excited about the results we've been seeing and the sorts of life-changing stories we've encountered.
So what are the things that somebody can do? Give us some tips, for how to
Sure.
reduce the toxicity of this or address the toxicity of our lifestyle.
Well, in a nutshell, we've identified 6 different factors that have robust research evidence already as being powerfully antidepressant, powerfully changing brain function, cognitive function, changing our lives. Things that, interestingly enough, our ancestors got a lot more of than we do. And we can just identify them really easily. So in no particular order, physical activity or physical exercise. And I know exercise is a 4-letter word for a lot of people. On Saturday, I asked for a show of hands of participants there who had tried to increase their level of exercise and hadn't succeeded. All the people, I just said, how many of you have made a resolution to have some sort of fitness plan and it didn't take? And virtually every hand went up. And so there are 2 things about that. One is exercise is unnatural. Exercise is completely unnatural for us. We're not wired to exercise. We're wired to be physically active in the service of a goal. Our ancestors had a life that was, in essence, already apportioned for them as one that was going to be physically active if they were going to survive. Hunter-gatherers are physically active about 4 hours a day, vigorously. active. They have a fitness level that would rival that of our elite athletes, of our Olympic athletes. Even folks our age, and I'm going to put us in about the same age category, that have put 40 in their rearview mirror. I mean, if they live that long in a hunter-gatherer context, they are still extraordinarily physically fit because they have to be. Their lifestyle is filled with activities that are purposeful, that are meaningful, that engage them, and that are very physically vigorous. An example, the average visitor to Walt Disney World. In the year 2012, the average visitor to Walt Disney World is not terribly physically fit. They walk an average of about 8 miles. Why? Because they're engaged, because they have to, to meet the goals that they have for themselves. The problem for us is that we've engineered the need for physical activity right out of 21st century life. We've completely engineered, and we could think of all the different ways, ranging from our automobiles to our appliances to our power mowers to our escalators and elevators, and all the different ways in which we now have a culture dedicated to the proposition that nobody should have to be physically active under any circumstances, and that that's somehow a hardship. Well, our brains are wired to rejoice in that. When hunter-gatherer groups are introduced to missionaries who show them some way of saving labor and effort and calories and expenditure, they adopt it instantly and they celebrate and they say, fantastic. When we look at a lab rat and we put it on a treadmill in a harness and we crank that puppy up to the point where they're now getting aerobic exercise, the lab rats immediately protest. They squat down on their haunches to the point where the treadmill wears away the fur and skin off their backside. They feel our pain of their inability to embrace exercise for its own sake. We're not wired to exercise for its own sake, and yet we desperately need exercise. It changes brain chemistry more powerful than any medication. It changes signaling in the brain's serotonin circuits, the brain's dopamine circuits. It causes a profound release of a healing growth hormone in the brain called BDNF that heals damage moment to moment from oxidative stress, that helps us grow new connections between brain circuits, makes us mentally sharp, slows down the aging process. Adam, one of the things I tell my patients, one of the things I tell my students is if we could take the neurochemical changes induced by exercise and put it in a pill, all the benefits, no side effects, if we could just market that little pill, put it out on the market tomorrow, overnight it would become the best-selling medication that the world has ever seen. So we desperately need this, and yet we're wired not to get it, so we have to be clever. We have to be really clever. And so what we've been doing at the University of Kansas over the past 6 years is helping individuals find a pathway to engaging physical activity, something that feels like they want to be doing it, it's in the service of a goal. For most individuals, believe it or not, just brisk walking is enough to get their heart rate up into that aerobic zone, and that's really the tipping point. That's where all the beneficial neurological changes start to take place, once it's aerobic, once our pulse is up, depending on how old we are, up between 120 and 150 or so. For most individuals, just walking like they're late for their plane, they're late for their bus, that's enough to get it going. And so we hook our patients up with a personal trainer. One of the things I tell my colleagues about this, because I have a lot of colleagues that have contacted me over the last few years, not just in the local area, but from all over the country and a few from other parts of the world. And they've said, okay, great, I understand what you're saying and I believe you're onto something important. I'm going to start telling my depressed patients to exercise, that they should start exercising more. And I say, no. That's the last thing you want to do. That's cruel. Because if you tell somebody who's clinically depressed, you should exercise more, they will believe it and they'll intend to do it. Unfortunately, depression turns off the circuits in the brain that allow us to translate our intentions into actions. And so the person will typically, there are some exceptions, but typically they will sit there and torment themselves and beat themselves up and say, oh, I should be doing this. I know it's my fault. I'm a horrible person. They can't initiate it. And so what I say is, no, you need to provide a context in which they can succeed. Because people who are depressed can exercise, but they cannot initiate exercise. So hook them up with someone, probably the best solution is a personal trainer, because they have that requisite training and background in how to get someone enjoying physical activity. But it can be a spouse, it can be a loved one, a best friend, It can be a pastoral counselor. I mean, it's anyone who's willing to partner with them to give them that phone call in advance or that text that says, hey, just a little tickler, a little reminder, we're going to meet in 15 minutes. That's enough. That's that little spark of initiative. Okay, I can lace my sneakers. I don't want to. I feel horrible, but gonna do this. And then there's that accountability piece, which also really makes a difference.
So one of the 6 things that you've recommended that if people were actually to focus on this and learn how to do them would make a huge impact on depression.
Okay, I'm going to give it to you in a really crisp, condensed form. So, number 1, intense physical activity, aerobic level activity where our pulse is up in that range between 120 and 150, at least 30 minutes 3 times a week. Omega-3 supplementation. We typically advise daily dose of at least 1,000 milligrams of an omega-3 acid called EPA. Daily bright light sunlight exposure. Sunlight is at least 100 times brighter than indoor light. We want people getting out in the sun, typically in the morning for at least 30 minutes. In the wintertime, there are light boxes that can simulate that same experience. Number 4, sleep. Sleep is critically important to how we feel. Most adults require 7 to 8 hours per night. We need to help them make that a priority and then establish healthy habits of sleep so that while they're in bed, they can actually be sleeping. Social connection. We are wired to belong. We are a social species. We need intimate, in-depth, extensive connection with others, and we could take an hour to unpack that. And then finally, engaging activity. When people are alone, they tend to brood over their negative thoughts, they tend to ruminate. They dwell on them, and it's psychologically toxic, it's neurologically toxic, and so we teach individuals to turn their attention away from their inner world of their inner thoughts to the outer world of people and activities that we're designed for.
Excellent. How does spirituality and connecting with the church tie into any of those? I mean, I'm instantly hearing them, but what do you see in terms of faith, involvement in church, a faith community? In terms of depression?
Well, one of the most profound findings, I think, is that people who have an active faith, and especially those who are actively plugged into a faith community, are dramatically less likely to become clinically depressed. When they do become depressed, on average, they recover more quickly. They, on average, are happier. They report higher levels of life satisfaction. They are more likely to stay married. Now, there are no guarantees, right? And as someone who grew up in the church, as someone who's been treating people of faith for the last 20 years, I can tell you there are a whole lot of clinically depressed Christians, a whole lot of clinically depressed people of faith of any faith tradition. So it is protective, but not completely, because we are immersed in a cultural context that is profoundly depressogenic, in other words, profoundly capable of triggering depression. Many times when a Christian when they start to slide down that slope of clinical depression, they start beating themselves up in uniquely Christian ways. So it becomes, not only am I a horrible person, but I'm a wretched sinner whom God is so profoundly disappointed with, he's going to send me straight to hell. Do not pass go, do not collect $200. So it's quite possible for Christians to be particularly hard on themselves in ways that are really being driven by the depression, but yet somehow amplified by a twisted notion of what the Christian faith is about.
What would you, so let's say I have a friend who's seriously depressed, who's clinically depressed. How can I help them? What could people in our congregation this Sunday say to folks, or how do they come alongside them and help them?
Yeah, one of the things we need to, I think, really get out on the table is that many individuals, when they are clinically depressed, remember, they're pulling away, and they can hurt our feelings. They don't mean to, but it hurts my feelings as a friend when I reach out to someone that I feel might be in pain. Then maybe they're not being open with me about exactly what's going on, but I know something's going on, and I reach out and I say, "Hey, would you like to come over? We haven't seen each other, or let's go grab lunch or go grab coffee," and they don't return the email, or they blow it off, and the text goes unanswered for 5 days, and maybe we get together and they just seem really like they're not having a good time. I feel like they're pushing me away. That's the experience of many friends and loved ones of someone who's clinically depressed. And what I would say to them is see it not as rejection, see it as a symptom of the illness. This is a person who's suffering, who's in pain. Very often they're tormented with thoughts that I'm bringing that person down. You know, I'm hurting that person. They don't want to be around me, and it's better for them that I not interact with them. And so what happens is many friends and loved ones eventually hit a tipping point where they're just like, okay, fine, I'm going to wash my hands of it. You know, when you get your act together, then maybe we'll resume our friendship. But a lot of damage can occur. And so what I would say, number one, to the friend, to the family member, is hang in there with them. That's really what sacrificial love is about. That's that sort of agape love is staying there for someone, even if if it feels like there's nothing in it for you, even if it's personally painful to feel like you're being pushed away. The second thing I would say is many individuals with depression, if they find a friend or loved one that they decide they will spend time with, they want to ruminate with them out loud. And this is toxic. It's toxic to the relationship, but it's toxic to the individual. And we might think, because there's a cultural meme out there that says, oh, it's great to talk about your problems. We think, oh, great, I'll be a good listener. I'll sit with them, listen to them, and they start ruminating out loud, and they're off to the races, and pretty soon an hour's passed, and nobody's doing any better at the end of that. Now, this can be misconstrued. I'm not saying that we never want to listen when a friend is hurting. But if our friend is clinically depressed, we need to have some sort of firm limit. It can be explicitly discussed or just implicitly internalized, where we say, what we really need to do, what's really going to help my friend is not allowing them to ruminate out loud. It's shared activity. We're designed for sharing life together. So what I need to do is get them out of their head. What I need to do is get them reconnected with life. And one of our mantras in our program at University of Kansas for depressed individuals, and this could be misconstrued as well, is don't think, do. And we're not telling people never to think, but we're saying when you're depressed, you're living inside your head way too much. We need to get you out of your head and out into the world again. And so we can do that as a friend or loved one. We may need to have that conversation with them to help them understand the importance of shared activity. Many individuals who are depressed have found, much to their surprise, that they can best tolerate, or often best tolerate, social interaction when they're giving, which is paradoxical. They don't often want to be around someone else, but if they can force themselves, and it may feel like forcing themselves early on, to give to others, even if it's volunteering at Habitat for Humanity. In fact, I had a patient, Adam, about 5 years ago, and she was depressed, and we were going through this treatment program together, and we talked about how isolated she was, and how one of the first things we were going to target was helping her avoid time alone. And she spent most of her day, every day, alone. And she started volunteering at Habitat, and she came back in the next week, and she raved about what an amazing experience this was. And my first assumption is, oh, okay, so she got there and started interacting with everybody else, and this was great, and they found all these shared interests. And I floated this hypothesis. She shot it down. She said, no, I didn't talk to anybody. Oh, okay. Well, so what was helpful? She said, just being in their presence. And, neuroscientists have found that when we're simply in the presence of people that we feel connected to, even if it's a shared mission, a shared faith, a shared purpose, we're a very groupish species. And for our ancestors, for hundreds of thousands of years, simply belonging to the group was a prerequisite to survival. And it sends a powerful signal to the brain when we are part of a group that's engaged in some sort of groupish activity that, we belong, we matter, we're important. And it was overwhelming for her in a very positive way.
That's great. What about, what would you say to people who are watching your interview clip who've had suicidal thoughts? Mm-hmm. They're at the point where they're thinking, because I'm pretty sure we're going to have a number of people who are inviting their friends these are people who've been seriously considering and already planning for how they're going to take their life. what kinds of things would you say? What would you tell them?
The first thing I would tell them is I understand. I would say it is cruel to judge someone unless we've walked a mile in their brain chemistry. When someone is in that much pain and feels that much hopelessness, I understand why suicide feels like something they would consider, and yet I would ask them to trust me when I say that I've worked with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of patients over the years and found that depression is time limited. It feels like it will never lift, but it does. The body has a remarkable ability to heal itself. And here's something else that I would say, and I discovered this when I was teaching an undergraduate course 17 years ago, and a student asked me about, when in the course of depression is suicide most likely to occur? And I said, the best evidence we have right now is that it's not, if you think of somebody being at health and they fall into this trough of depression, it's not when they hit bottom. It's not even after they've been at the bottom for a long period of time. It's as they start coming out. While they're actually starting to see some improvement, they still have the negative distortion, so they can't even see the improvement. Other people objectively can see it. We can measure it with clinical instruments that they're improving. They don't know they're improving, but they're getting more energy and they're getting more initiative. And because they're in pain and they don't see that they're improving, but they have that initiative and that energy, that's when they're particularly likely to act on those suicidal thoughts. Well, I gave this lecture 17 years ago. And a month and a half later, I found, slid under my office door, an anonymous note from a student. She described that moment in the lecture. She drew me the little graph that I'd put up on the board. And she said, Dr. Ilardi, I just wanted you to know that I had a loaded .38 on my bedstand, and I was planning to blow my brains out. And when you told me that in that lecture, it caused me to doubt and to think, well, is it possible, A, that there could be hope, and B, that I might actually be on the road to recovering and not know it. And I broke down and I called my boyfriend, and he came over and he took the gun and he drove me to the ER, and I got in treatment. And I've been in treatment for the last several weeks, and I'm on my way. Thank you so much just for letting me know that that was a possibility. And so there is hope. And suicide, it sounds really cliche, and I think it is a cliche to put it this way, but I'll say it anyway. It's a permanent solution to a temporary problem. It feels like there's no way anything could improve, but it can and it will.
Mention first then this piece about, you've said that being diagnosed with and actually struggling with clinical depression is worse than being diagnosed with cancer. Say more about that.
I ran into a patient not too long ago who talked about the experience of being diagnosed with cancer, a type of lymphoma, and he was in treatment, had gone through radiation and chemo, lost his hair, and the outpouring of support and love and affection was overwhelming. And it made him really angry because 5 years earlier, he'd been clinically depressed. And he said the pain that he experienced in depression was orders of magnitude greater than the pain of cancer and of going through radiation and chemo. He said the suffering, he said it's no contest, and yet nobody could see it. And when he would try to share it with people, they would shrug, they would minimize it, they would say, oh yeah, a chemical imbalance, we'll take your meds and, it'll be fine. And it made him really, really angry and really sad at the same time. And I just thought it was a profound insight that none of us would imagine minimizing the suffering of someone who's going through radiation and chemo and battling cancer. None of us would imagine saying to them, hey, let's go do something fun and we'll help you snap out of it. And yet this happens to people with depression every day.
If somebody is listening to this and they're on antidepressants, what would you say to them? You've suggested 6 things that don't involve antidepressants.
Yes.
So what is your sense here?
Yeah. Well, I am first and foremost dedicated to helping people get well and stay well. Some people have had a positive response to medication. I rejoice in that. Our program is not anti-medication. It serves for many as a supplement to it. Many people find a little bit of benefit on the meds. They come into our program still fully depressed, maybe not quite as severely as they had been, find recovery. We always tell them, and I'll tell folks that might be listening, stay on the medication, at least until the point where, number one, you've had a chance to discuss it with your doctor who's prescribed them, and number two, for every patient that I'm personally treating, I say, let's get you fully well. Let's get you fully recovered by changing your life. Let's get you stable and in recovery and enjoying life again and connected in all the ways that you need to be flourishing. And then let's visit this question of medication. Many of my patients over the years have made it to that point, and in coordination with their prescribing physician, we've helped them through that tapering process. The most tragic thing someone can do is throw their medications away without consulting with their doctor, because unfortunately the medications often have a very difficult and painful withdrawal syndrome. So many of us have experienced, say, withdrawal from caffeine, where for a day or two we feel sluggish and we have a blinding headache, and we think, why am I doing this? Well, withdrawal from a powerful mood-altering antidepressant is often much more profound than the pain of withdrawing from caffeine. And the last thing we want is for someone during the process of recovering from their depression to have to face that sort of difficult and painful challenge. So we generally, we always advise that they stay on the medication, always talk with their prescribing physician. What we're finding with every disease of civilization, whether it be obesity or diabetes or heart disease or depression, is that there is an underlying genetic vulnerability that makes some people more susceptible than others, even though these are illnesses of lifestyle. And nobody disputes that, for example, obesity has a very important lifestyle component. We know that some people are genetically much more predisposed to put on weight when they're put in a context where they have a lot more access to calories and much less physical activity. Some people are genetically protected. It turns out, Adam, that some people are so neurologically protected from depression that they can be put in a Holocaust concentration camp level of stress and still emerge without having experienced depression. In other words, their brain is going through that runaway stress response, but it's not shutting them down. Some people are genetically protected. They're few and they're lucky. Others are genetically much more vulnerable, and certainly we see that risk for depression runs in families just like the risk for diabetes and obesity, and yet none of us would ever think with those disorders that lifestyle doesn't matter. So just because something has a genetic susceptibility tells us nothing about the importance of lifestyle as the predisposing and maintaining factor. Mm-hmm. Probably the most important thing that we haven't talked about is the fact that we can put these 6 lifestyle changes out there. We can talk about the importance of physical activity. We can talk about the importance of being connected, the importance of putting an end to toxic rumination. We can put that out there for somebody who's depressed, but what I found over the years is that most clinically depressed individuals, especially those with severe depression, they're not going to be capable of making those changes on their own. They are capable of making the changes, but they very often need help. Usually the help is that of an expert. Usually it's a clinician like myself with years of training and experience that can coach them through that process, that can metaphorically hold their hand, give them that encouragement. But it can also be a supportive group, such as those that are being conducted here at Resurrection. The point is that when we are that severely depressed, we usually need the help of one or more people who care about us to get us re-engaged in the process of recovery. I was reflecting recently with Pastor Stephen Blair, who has been instrumental in taking the program that we developed at University of Kansas and applying it here in this context. This is where the rubber hits the road. We're doing controlled clinical research, and we have another set of groups that are running in our clinic at KU. Over the last 6 years, we've treated a few hundred individuals, probably just over 200. You've treated more at Resurrection, and that gives me enormous satisfaction and joy to see. As best I know, Resurrection has been on the cutting edge of applying this treatment model in this program more than any place else in the world. So that's, I think, something to feel really good about.
So tell us about your book.
The book is called The Depression Cure, and it's a very brazen title. It's one that I wrestled with my publisher about. As I'm trained as an academic, as a researcher, we're trained to be very, very cautious and careful. And we're trained generally to communicate only with other intellectuals, to communicate only in very abstruse, scholarly, complex language with an audience of maybe 50 other people in the world who can actually care about what we're talking about. And when I started seeing so many lives transformed early on in our clinical research process, I started to feel a real sense of responsibility to get the word out there. And it felt premature in a way because we hadn't completed our research. We hadn't seen it independently replicated elsewhere, and yet the principles that we were building on are quite robust. And so I wrestled with it, and at the end of the day, I say this to my colleagues. Most of my colleagues are either atheists or agnostic. And yet most of them, it's interesting. Here's what I told them when they asked. I said, have you ever had one of those situations in life where it's just like the stars align and doors start opening and it's like you're not even really looking to make it happen, and it's as if the universe is telling you this is something that should happen? That's the way it was with this book project. People started suggesting to me that, you should put this in book form and you should write it for folks who are suffering from depression. And I dismissed it, and it kept coming up in different ways. And then I was put in touch with a dear friend, Harriet Lerner, who has written a series of books, best known as called The Dance of Anger, sold 3 million copies worldwide. She took a look at a little draft chapter that I put together. She sent it to her agent, powerhouse agent, who said, I want to represent this book. She started shopping the idea to publishers. They jumped on it, and it just came together in a way that I wasn't really even looking for. So it's been immensely gratifying to see the word start to get out there. The book has already sold over 50,000 copies internationally. It's available in 5 languages. So it's, and probably the most gratifying thing is, even though I wrote it for those suffering from depression, many of the letters and emails that I've gotten have been from clinicians, from therapists and psychologists and MDs who have had the book introduced to them by their patients, who have then read it themselves and said, this has changed the way I practice. Never anticipated that, but it's been very gratifying.
That's awesome. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Very cool.